Alright, so we're back. And I'm gonna try this instead. Oh, it's a good thing that doesn't actually show that there, but geez, that's really close. What's with this? Chat, two viewers, new. 2 people checked right at the start or something. Anyway. Chat, oh, I was on monitor. I wanna rank you guys, no, wait, okay. What chat link? Jesus. I'll just download this shit. I think this would only work for Windows. The other one, I was on my Mac before. Alright, and let's just see how this works in general. Hopefully, way better. I think it was just Fuzzbot must have like a memory leak or something. It's gotta be. Or perchance. Oh no, because nothing. The map had been working pretty well until now. Maybe loading all of that foliage one time was enough. All of the shadowed foliage one time was enough to just make it chug from then on. Alright, yeah, that's better. Oh, the fucking download. Yes, okay. Should I do the sound if it's one of these things too? Needs to be a little bit higher. Oh yeah, I was gonna test items. Okay. Just block this real quick. That was a fascinating GDC, so I'm gonna have to, well, it's still paste? No. Which key is the saddest? Oh my god, this added melee guy is awesome. I really like it. Continue watching. There we go.
Up, down. And that's how it appeared in the game. The final fight with Jafar.
I don't think I want to make it update automatically because it's like an event tick thing.
So, of course, yet again, Tommy was right. And my New Year's resolution for 1989 was simply to finish the game. So, designing those levels, I went back and I played my favorite platform games again, trying to figure out what it was that made games fun and addictive, trying to get the right balance of action, exploration, puzzles, and the level editor, of course, made it so easy to remake the levels.
This is why Arc sucks, because you have to click on things. Should make it like the collision
where
instead.
I've been living for the last 3 years. Yes, that is a mullet.
Let's see.
And they say programmers have no sense of style. I'm going to read something I wrote in my journal about this time because I think it really captures that particular moment.
Fussbot's not going to work while it's like this.
The game is definitely entering a new phase. The serene, solitary part of it is ending, and other people are getting into the act. My job now is not just trying to make a fun game, but getting people excited about it, and to a degree orchestrating their efforts without stepping on their toes. The world has left me alone for 2.5 years, and now it's bursting in.
Curious though, what if I just don't use the chat on Fussbot?
There's so much work still to do.
I know I'm running a lot of programs here, but
that's a feeling I can still identify with. And I think any book author knows how it feels to let go of the thing that's been yours and let other people start doing their thing. This is a sketch that I did for the package art, which all the stuff, marketing discussions, talking about conversions and so forth, was really important, and I really wanted to be involved in it. But at the same time, it was taking my time away from what I needed to be doing, which was finishing the game. Again, just to kind of place us in the historical timeline. This is a finished level from the game. You can see this is sort of how that first level of Raiders of the Lost Ark that had inspired the game in the first place kind of found its way into specific moments within the levels. Remember the moment when Indiana Jones is fighting the soldier on the propeller of the plane and backs him into the... Yeah, that was my version of that. About this time, a friend brought his sons, who were 5 and 7 years old, into the office. And for half an hour, I got to just sit and watch them play the game. And that was really a great moment because I didn't say anything. I just watched them play. I watched them die on the spikes over and over for half an hour. But they kept coming back. They kept trying it again and again. And I realized that the game was, first of all, the game was working. Which was very rewarding to see. But most importantly, I liked these kids, and I saw that they loved games, and the fact that I had made a game that they thought was cool and they were willing to play it kind of reminded me of why I had begun this in the first place, and it really made the whole thing worthwhile. This was oh,
maybe 100 is good for the first time. It was doing it
as I was building the final levels, I was trying to think of ways to create special moments in the game that people would remember, so it wasn't all the same thing over and over. But there was no time to create new assets. And of course, a lot of the great ideas that I'd had, like the skeleton coming to life,
Jesus, these stupid
the little white mouse. A lot of these had to go by the board, so there was just no time to do them. So many of those moments that we remember from the game sort of got crammed in there in those last few weeks.
Windows. Okay. Actually, I think set relative is good.
Again, just to put these struggles into perspective, the Iron Curtain was coming down.
And
I
being
went to
able
New
to
York
click on
for a week to work with my dad. He'd offered to compose the music for the game within the limitations of the Apple II speaker, which couldn't really play 2 notes at the same time. So he'd play the music on his Steinway, and I'd walk over to the computer and I'd type in the hexadecimal note values to try to simulate what he'd done. It was pretty agonizing, but even that crude music added a lot to the game. This is the opening sequence.
Gotta play these really old PC games again, like Oregon Trail, Prince of Persia, classics.
This is the penultimate battle here with before you go fight Jafar. And again, how do you create a boss fight when you've got no time or memory to put in new animations? This is the battle with your shadow self. And the trick here was that every time you hit him, you lost a point of your strength, because of course he's your reflection. He is you. So the only way you could win this fight is to go against every reflex that you've learned in the course of the game, put down your sword and rejoin with him, and then you get back all the hit points that you've lost along the way. And most importantly, I was able to do this in a day. As a last reshoot, that's Brian Ehler, producer, and that's Peter Rideau's daughter, Tina, in her prom dress, in the glamorous attic office. And yeah, Brian Ehler that day. And that's the game. And I see we're actually out of time. Do people need to go? I could talk for 5 more minutes.
I guess.
Okay. If anybody needs to leave, I totally understand, and thank you for coming. Okay, so we're at Goldmaster. You know, I'd fixed all the last bugs, and
he just keeps going. He doesn't even take questions. I love it.
I would like to say that the game went on to become a big hit, and the rest is history.
I guess he was the last person of the day.
Once again, I have these old journals, which remind me of what really happened. As I might have mentioned, the Apple II market was dying, and this Christmas '89, it was still possible for certain games like Vertebran's top seller, Where in Time is Carmen Sandiego, could still sell 15,000 copies in 1 month. Nice. But stores at this point were kind of closing down their Apple sections. They were not interested in taking on new Apple
I am Easton slaps WR Productions around a bit with a large trout.
I endured the agony of seeing that Karateka, which was a 5-year-old game, was outselling Prince of Persia, just simply because stores didn't have it. Nobody would carry it. It was getting great reviews, but nobody knew about it. So I pinned all my hopes on the PC and Amiga conversions, which this is the PC version. As you can see, it was greatly enhanced with color, better sound, using the MIDI sound card. And my dad went back and reorchestrated the music to take advantage of what this machine could do. Real artists came in and redid the graphics to make them more beautiful. And the PC was the top platform. It was on its way to world domination. And so I really pinned my hopes on the Prince of Persia becoming a hit in its PC version. Released in May 1990, and it didn't sell. There were a lot of reasons for that. One was that it was a conversion, not an original title. Stores didn't really want to carry conversions of a title that hadn't sold well in the first place. And also, it was a flip-top box, which was seen as very old-fashioned. At this time, all the top-selling games came in bigger candy boxes, and that's what stores wanted to carry.
Blue is really hard to read.
So, in September, I got the chilling news that the largest chain electronics boutique had recalled and delisted the game in all formats.
Jesus.
So, this was a year after the first release. Prince of Persia had sold 10,000 copies in all formats, and it looked like that was going to be it. So I kind of figured, okay, this is a long story short. We were saved by a combination of factors.
Hey, now be careful
the Mac
with that.
Had been delayed by the programmer who was doing it. Was very methodical, and he had remade the game every time a new Mac came out, so that first for the LC for color graphics, and then for the large screen, so that by the time it finally came out 2 years late, there was a Mac market ready and waiting for this game. There was a new marketing department. They re-released the game in a new candy box, and suddenly, years after its release, Prince of Persia was selling. And most importantly, the foreign and console versions, which had been done by teams I'd never met in countries where I'd never been, were now released. And Prince of Persia went on to sell on all platforms worldwide, 2 million copies. Anyway, we're out of time. If you want to hear more details about... thank you. Thank you.
It's all right. Okay, cool.
Thank you. You're very kind.
Okay, if it's already the same thing, we don't need to do any sounds or any of that jazz. And, I don't know if I want to make the sound every time you click. So I'm going to do if selected actor equals none here. Oops, what's playing now? No, I've seen that a billion times. What the fuck? Oof, I think I watched this. That was sad. Looking for long videos. Day 6. I've seen this. I've seen that, I think.
On such a tricky theme. We gathered reference from other art forms such as sculpture, painting, photography, and video art to pull a set of visual elements that would form the ingredient.
This talk is BS. Sorry, but I mean, how about, yeah.
Alright, so hi everybody, I'm Martin Walsh, and my talk is Modeling AI Perception and Awareness in Splinter Cell Blacklist. It's a 25-minute talk, so I'm going to try to keep it pretty tight, including this intro, but I do want to let you guys know I'm from Ubisoft Toronto. I was the AI lead on Blacklist, the AI tech lead on Splinter Cell Conviction, and I have about 10 years experience in the industry. So why perception and awareness? Well, I mean, if the AI in your game doesn't always magically know where the player is, you need some type of perception and awareness model. And with more and more games incorporating stealth elements, how these models function can really shape the quality of the experience you provide. And Blacklist obviously has a very heavy stealth component, so for us these models are extremely important.
In between green and red.
But before I start describing them, I just want to talk about 3 characteristics that I think these models need to display
to be really
good.
I don't know. Let me check. Just
so first of all, they need to feel fair, right? I mean, if you're sort of, getting detected can really be the difference between success and like chucking your controller at the screen, especially if you feel that that detection was unfair.
I kind of like the purple, actually.
And second is they need to provide consistent feedback, right? So you need to have some idea of how the AI is going to react, what they're reacting to, so that you can strategize and improve.
That should be, yeah, maybe based on.
And the third is that they need to demonstrate intelligence, right? If your opponents feel dumb, then you really get no satisfaction in beating them. But what's interesting is not being dumb doesn't necessarily mean being smart. And what it actually means is always being plausible. And that's something that I'll come back to a lot throughout this talk. And finally, it's interesting to note that there's often a conflict that exists between fairness, consistency, and intelligence. And that's something that's important to be aware of, and I'll allude to that as well throughout the presentation. So I'm going to talk about 4 types of perception and awareness. But before I jump in, I just want to let you guys know I'm going to stop saying perception and awareness because it's really long and annoying to say. And although they are 2 different things, awareness almost always follows right after perception. So in this talk, I'm going to kind of use those 2 terms interchangeably.
So if it's already...
Okay, so the 4 models I'm going to talk about are visual, environmental,
I think in all cases,
auditory, and social and contextual, with the 2 most common obviously being visual and auditory. So let's jump right in. So visual perception. So often, right, this is how we think about vision in games, right? The classic vision cone. And this does a decent job of modeling like what's directly in front of the NPC and what he should detect pretty quickly. But it's not a great model. It doesn't do a good job of modeling peripheral vision. It doesn't really model vision at a distance very well. So this is vision in real life, right? This is how we see in real life. So we actually have close to like 180 degrees of vision, But as things move away from our focal point, we start to see them less and less clearly. And this is vision in blacklist. So if I were you, I'd be thinking, like, what the hell is all this crap, right? But honestly, all that stuff really is there for a reason. I'll describe a couple of things that you're seeing here. So first of all, we do actually have the standard vision cone, which is that orange V that I've marked out there. And this reflects the area where the NPC, can see detail and should be able to spot the player pretty quickly. And we actually had multiple nested cones, so player obviously would get spotted faster in the innermost cone. And then we also have those coffin-shaped boxes that you can see on the outside marked by those yellow lines. And this defines the entire area that the NPC should be able to see. And what's interesting to note about these boxes is that, as opposed to a cone that expands at a distance, they actually shrink at a distance, which models the fact that, you'll still tend to notice things that are directly in front of you, even at a distance, but not necessarily the things that are off to the side. And these are also nested, and here we're displaying the outermost. And so for each of these, our designer had to specify how many nested shapes there were, their sizes, and the linear detection range for each, where the min of that range is the time to detect the player when he's closest to the NPC, and the max, obviously, the farthest. And our designer had to specify that sort of per player stance, per difficulty, and per archetype. So that was a lot of fun for our designer. And then what happens at runtime is these shapes get checked in order, and then the time range of the first inclusive shape is used. And, there are also other shapes there that I've pointed one out, which is the peripheral vision shape. There's also those kind of wings that you can see in the back of the NPC, which is our sixth sense shape. I'm not going to talk about those, but you sort of get the idea. But, obviously being in a shape isn't enough to get detected, right? You have to be seen, in other words, unobstructed, and you have to be lit. And so what our detection model does is it raycasts to 8 different bones on the player's body, one per frame. And then depending on the stance, it takes more or less bones to be detected. So in this case, you can see Sam Fisher is in cover, and so that's the stance that actually takes the most bones. And here there are only 2 bones that are visible to the NPC, so detection hasn't actually started yet. So then finally, once enough lit bones are seen, that's when the player starts getting detected, right? And so that's when that range-based timer kicks in. You can see it represented by that HUD, which is actually a growing arc. And the tuning of this timing and feedback is really critical to the player, right? This represents really his window of opportunity to break line of sight or maybe kill the NPC, otherwise he's going to get detected. So, naturally with a model this complex, we tuned it a couple times by eye, and then we were good to go. No, it was brutal. It was brutal. Tuning it was a nightmare. And actually, so what happened was our designer tweaked it until, he thought it was fun, and our creative director thought it was fun, and then we went to play tests, and the results were awful. They were all over the place. Some people thought they were getting detected too fast, some too slow. So our designer combed through hours of playtest video, and he identified sort of 3 major issues that we had. So the first was that we had some special case code. So our designers wanted it that in certain situations, if the player was in cover, the NPC would walk right by him without detecting him, even if our model said he should have been detected. And this was actually fun in a lot of situations, but we found in the video that actually what was happening sometimes is that the NPC's flashlight would be lighting up the player sort of at random, and then he still wouldn't be detecting him. So our solution to this, unfortunately, was just more special case code, which is essentially just, if lit by flashlight, ignore the other code. So not necessarily our finest moment, but it worked. So the second issue that we found was that the players were getting detected too easily at a distance, and specifically at a distance but when they weren't directly in front of the NPC. So obviously this is what led to us changing. We originally just had regular boxes, and we changed them to these coffin-shaped boxes that I talked about. And the third thing was that we were finding that players were just getting, that it was actually too easy overall. So once we kind of got rid of those other issues, then actually the players found it too easy. And so, the solution to that was that we just kept tweaking. And we literally did that until the end of the project. And what happened was that, after every playtest, the results started to converge, so that by the final playtest, very few participants actually mentioned vision one way or the other. And the couple that did were sort of split on the issue, so we really kind of felt like we'd hit our sweet spot. So in the end, we were really happy with the results, but it wasn't easy getting there, obviously. And, one thing we realized was that the players actually wanted a more sophisticated and less forgiving vision model than we had initially anticipated. And, if I had to do it again, I'd probably try to playtest this a lot earlier than we did. So the second type of awareness I want to talk about is environmental awareness, which our illustrious Mayor Rob Ford is doing a great job of
profile screen. Anytime I press I, bam.
But for us, environmental awareness really means two things. So the first is, being aware of...
Did you ban me from your Discord?
So layout tells you stuff like, for example, I'm in a large room, it's connected to a hallway by 2 doors, or maybe if there was a window by a window. And then once you have that type of information, you can start reasoning about the player's location in interesting ways, right, with respect to the environment. So you can start thinking about stuff like he's hiding in a dead end, or he's sniping us from a rooftop that we can't get to. And I'll actually discuss that specific example a bit later on. And then the second is awareness of objects, or more specifically, like awareness to changes in objects, like a door that got opened or a light that got turned on or something like that. So why is this important for us, right? Well, one reason is that our encounters can start anywhere, right? So you could have literally stealthed your way through like 3/4 of the level, you get detected there, and that's where our encounter starts, right? So that's in contrast to a lot of sort of more linear shooters where they can stage the encounters. But unlike a lot of stealth games, we didn't want, being detected to be a failure condition. We wouldn't want you to reset.
If you just can remember the reason why I banned you,
be able to play the game like a cover shooter,
you would know why
with the added ability of being able to vanish or maybe outflank the NPCs and then recreate those initial stealth conditions. So older versions of Splinter Cell only supported a max of 4 active NPCs. So those guys always had something to do, and shooting actually wasn't really an option. But for us, and in Conviction as well, we had 12 active NPCs, and the player can see them all the time. He has vision modes that he can use to see them through walls. He could outflank them during combat. So really those guys need to be doing something intelligent all the time. And using the old system, which again was just designed for 4, and also all they were concerned with was getting line of sight on the player, what happened was a lot of the times you just see NPCs that were staring at the player through walls, which obviously doesn't look intelligent. So on Conviction, we developed a solution to this that we call the TEAS. It's a new AI model of the environment for us. So TEAS stands for Tactical Environment Awareness System.
Oh, it's still doing it even though it's
so
nothing.
what this consists of, it's essentially position nodes that are linked to other position nodes through choke nodes. And what that represents here is you can see that red position node that I've marked out, and it's above that blue area. And so what it says is that blue area is connected to that yellow area. You can't see the position node for that because it's inside the room, through that green choke node, which represents the door. And so now NPCs have a lot more info about the environment, right? And so in the case where an NPC can't, or maybe even shouldn't, engage the player, he can now go ahead and guard the door or window or whatever choke it is that's leading to the player, and that obviously produces much more believable behavior. And what's interesting about this is we actually auto-generated it. So the way it worked was our level designers would paint the nav mesh, so they'd paint the blue area and the yellow area, and then we'd auto-generate the position nodes and the choke nodes. But then we allowed the designers to manipulate them. And the reason for that was that we actually used them sort of not just to identify the area that's directly below them, but they were actually fallback positions for our NPCs. So if they couldn't find a piece of cover that would give them a line of sight on the door, they knew they could always fall back to those position nodes. Like in this case, you can see the designer actually attached a second position node to that choke node that I didn't mark. And we actually used the TEAS for tons of stuff other than just that. We used it for coordinating room entries. We did it hierarchical pathfinding with it, and we even used it to calculate audio distance, and I'll talk about that in a second. So, and as I mentioned, sort of the second thing is awareness of changes to objects in the environment. And we actually got a ton of mileage out of NPCs noticing things like open doors or windows. And to do this, we used a really simple system called the changed actor system. So the idea was that when an actor would change state, it would create an event with a lifetime, and then the first NPC to witness that event would claim it, and then depending on his state and what was going on, it could prompt a minor investigation. And so, I mean, this could have been used tactically by the player, but really it was mostly there to give the impression of intelligence and awareness. And this was a really easy win for us, and it was actually something that was mentioned specifically in a couple of reviews. And it's kind of ironic, but not all that surprising that, the TEAS was this long, complicated system to develop, but like nobody mentioned the fact that our NPCs could guard doors, although, they probably would have mentioned it if they were staring through walls. But, as soon as the NPCs remarked that a door was opened, that's what people noticed. But, that's okay. So the third type of perception is auditory. So, in general, it's pretty simple, right? Every audio event has a distance and a priority. If an NPC is in range of that event, then he'll hear it, and he'll react differently based on the event, based on who else is in range, his current state, etc. We actually have 2 major issues with our audio.
I feel bad, but
So one was actually accurately calculating the audio distance. So obviously, you know, the Euclidean straight line distance isn't good enough, right? In a stealth game, you don't want to be heard through walls and stuff like that. So we tried using our sound engine, but our sound engine wasn't actually optimized to calculate sort of the distance between two random points in a world. And there was another issue as well, which is that our audio data was often out of sync with our level data, which caused all kinds of false positive bugs and stuff like that. So we started using the T's, and the way that we did this was, you know, the T's could tell us sort of the room
basically like criticizing my frame rate, saying like, oh, 90 is not, it's not even like a complicated scene.
The source and the destination, which would be where the NPC was. So,
that was after some other shit
too. We just took the
and
sum of the straight line distance. So in other words, it was the distance between sort of the source of the audio event to the closest choke node, to the closest choke node of the room leading to the next node, etc., all the way to the NPC. And the results were actually accurate enough that once we made that switch, we never looked back. It worked really well for us.
Yeah. Okay, so at least it's not doing it if it's the same one.
And the second problem with auditory events is it's really a general problem, actually, which is that it can feel really unfair to sort of, you know, be creating sounds that get noticed by NPCs that you don't even see, right? A guy around the corner could potentially hear the sound that you make, and you won't know why, and you may not even know that you made a sound, right? Because you don't really directly control the sounds that you're making. And so what would happen is, you know, the way we found this was in internal reviews, our creative director, you know, he'd be playing the game, and then he'd get detected, and he wouldn't know why, and he'd chuck the controller, and he'd look at me, and sometimes, you know, what we'd do is we'd pause the game, and we'd free cam around the corner, and we'd say, look, Max, you know, there's the NPC, and here's where you were, and you know, sometimes he'd agree, he'd be like, you know, yeah, that, you know, I guess it made sense that he heard me, but that didn't actually stop him from complaining the next time it happened, and ultimately he was right? I mean, it's kind of irrelevant. The player can't pause the game, the player can't free cam through the level. And so one thing that we learned here, and also in tuning some visual stuff, is that it's really only important what's plausible from the player's point of view, right? It doesn't matter what the NPC
I hate having to deal with this. It makes me not
from
want
a
to
simulation perspective. It's what the player thinks the NPC should be able to see.
Why do I have to fucking?
So I mean, you know, one way that we could have solved this was like brute force. We could have just tuned down the distance of all of our audio events. But then that would create, you know, a bunch of other problems, right? Like you don't want to be kind of running down a hallway towards an NPC with his back turned, and then he can only hear you sort of at the last second, and you know, you'd stab him in the neck just as he's turning around. Because not only does that sort of make them feel dumb, but also it's game breaking, right? You can just run through the entire game stabbing everyone in the neck. So this was a big problem, right? I mean, if you think about it, for two NPCs at exactly the same distance from the player, it can feel fair to get detected by the guy that you can see, and unfair to get detected by the guy who's right around the corner. So I mean, we considered having some HUD feedback for this, which might have helped, but I mean, design really wanted minimal HUD. So in the end, we solved this in two ways. So the first thing we did was that NPCs that are off screen and far enough away from the player that it's sort of plausible that that they didn't hear, had their hearing reduced by half for some events. And we actually applied this to some indirect visual events as well, like seeing an NPC get shot. And the result of this, that literally the game instantly became more fun, and almost as important for me, our creative director stopped complaining. By the way, that image is not supposed to be our creative director complaining. That's an NPC you can't hear. And then the second thing we did is we wanted to provide better feedback to the player, and we actually overhauled our entire BARC system, right, our entire sort of dialogue system on Blacklist. And because, you know, if the NPC calls out what he hears, right, if you're running and then you hear an NPC go, hey, I heard footsteps, then you instantly know what you did. But the problem is you obviously don't want to hear that line over and over again, right? It's pretty kind of on the nose. And so what we did is we developed a 3-tiered BARC system where the first tier were very specific, all the way down to the third tier that was much more generic. And then what we do is, as we ran out of you know, tier 1 BARCs to play, we dropped down to tier 2 and then tier 3. And so the result was that as a player, you sort of got the specific feedback you needed the first couple times that you did something. And then, you know, like I said, as we ran out of those specific things, then we could give more generic BARCs back to the player.
It's okay. I didn't know you can't handle criticism.
The last type of awareness that I want to discuss is social and contextual. And this is something that actually a lot of action games don't model at all.
How are you back? Like, this is the kind of bullshit I'm talking about. Like, why are you fucking here?
So we did this for two reasons.
It's not criticism.
So first of all, it makes
pedantry.
the NPCs seem more intelligent and more aware.
It wasn't criticism,
right?
if
and in our game, you spend more time looking at the NPCs than you do.
And then you went silent.
But we also use this system to create
anti-exploits
in the form of group behaviors. And I'll talk about that in a second. So specifically, I'm going to give you two examples. The first, I'll talk about our conversation system. And in the second, I'll show you one of our combat anti-exploit strategies. So in a lot of games, if you interrupt two NPCs talking,
I'll be back.
It usually does one of two things.
Right
it either
here.
kind of completely breaks the conversation and those NPCs just kind of walk off on
it.
their own, or the conversation restarts somehow, but it feels pretty robotic. And so in our game, when NPCs are in a conversation, they're actually in a group behavior. And so what that means is that they automatically become aware of each other. And that allows them to actually discuss minor events in context. So we had our narrative,
and then they go, aha, I got you.
Wrote specific
so
reaction and breakout and rejoin lines for each conversation we had. And you'll hear that in a second. And also, if one NPC stops talking or doesn't respond because he went to go investigate an event, the other is aware, so he'll, maybe go and investigate the spot where he thinks his buddy should have been. And just those things really give the impression of
he's sending me basic training videos that, it's obvious he's been on here a while, he knows that I show this shit myself.
Get a little wet, think you're gonna melt. It's slippery up here.
So, anyway, the rest of us have been covered.
Taking flying lessons. I mean, sure. Boy, you hear that? Yeah, it sounded like money. Now, what were you saying?
So, sorry. I guess we'll try it here instead, so that it will...
Fine, I'll take a look.
Sounds like monks chiming too.
Come on, talk to me!
So we really like that. And so yeah, the last thing I want to talk about is the combat anti-exploit I was referring to. So in this case, it's unreachable. So depending on where the player is and what the situation is, the AI may not be able to or may not want to directly engage the player in combat. And in that case, we had group behaviors which would play out as the situation unfolded, and specific dialogue lines that would give feedback to the player on what they were doing. But what's interesting to note, what you hear in this video, is that those lines aren't just call-outs. They don't just announce I'm throwing a grenade or I'm flanking or whatever, but they were actually discussions. So it didn't feel like the NPCs were just announcing what they were doing, but it felt like they were tactically coordinating. And this actually gave more interesting feedback to the player. So in this example, what you're going to see is the players ambushing the NPCs from an unreachable rooftop, which we know thanks to the T's. And you can hear them call that out, and you can hear them coordinate a strategy to deal with that. And so the way we did this was, so first of all, like I said, we could identify the player was in an unreachable area.
Have 100% valid
because we knew that there were, that the choke nodes that were leading to, all the choke nodes that were leading to the player in T's were non-crossable by NPCs. And also, I didn't mention it before, but we gave the LDs the power to sort of mark up those areas a bit more, so we could know if he was on a small rooftop or a balcony or whatever. And then when we detected that scenario, we would kick off a contextual group behavior. And we actually had, different varieties of those and variations within them. So for example, if this was, the second or third time that they'd seen the player in an area like this, they would have used the again version, which just had some dialogue substitution. So yeah, take a look.
Just in case anyone thinks I'm too bad, I gotta deal with this shit, it's fun. But I do have my choice. It's a new dog, it's a new day, that kind of shit. Let's try this.
What now? We can't get up there. Relax. We'll find him. He's still up there, right? He's not here anymore. Move out and find him.
So, and one thing that's interesting there is there the player sort of tried to outflank the NPCs, right? And so that's what you saw. But if you would have started picking them off from that rooftop, that behavior would have branched into the retreat behavior, where one of those guys would have called out, he's ambushing us, and started laying down suppressive fire while the other guys fell back to cover. And again, we were able to find good spots, kind of hiding spots for them, also using the T's. So that is it. Just before, I just want to say thank you to everyone who came out to support from Ubisoft, to Nick, Zach, and Heather for helping me out with this presentation, to the whole AI team who made all this cool stuff, and everyone we worked really closely with, Laurent, Chris, Josh, and the entire Blacklist team. Thanks a lot. So yeah, I think I actually do have time for questions. I guess those videos said it all, huh?
I have a question about over here, this side.
Oh wow, okay.
Yeah.
Some bright lights. Oh, there you go. Hi.
The question about the coffin-shaped perception boxes.
I didn't know.
Did that help a lot in terms of if the player's on a different level, he doesn't expect to be perceived, or if he's climbing onto something?
So that's a really good point. Yeah, I didn't mention that, but yeah, those, like you saw, those boxes were capped at the top. That was exactly it. And that was actually a metric that was sort of used by level design, so that when they would put pipes across the ceiling and stuff like that, they had to make sure that those pipes were outside of that box. Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
So when you have these cooperative tactics like flanking and covering fire and things like that, who's making the decisions to choose those tactics? Who's like giving commands to those characters? Is there like a leader-follower relationship? Is there a centralized AI that does that?
So we have, we have essentially a director, an AI manager essentially, that would detect those scenarios and then essentially kick off those behaviors. And we would elect, so some of those scenarios did have leaders, but we would elect those leaders on the fly essentially. But we would prioritize certain archetypes. So you didn't see it there, but we had, for example, a heavy archetype. So if a heavy archetype was present, he would become the leader of that group.
Hi, so good talk, first of all. One thing is, like, do you think that balancing the perception, because you said that you had like some kind of balancing on the different difficulty level for the game?
Yes.
So is that enough for giving like a good experience to the user? Because sometimes if you play an easy game mode, then you will get a really different experience for who plays the heavy one, but you get an experience different from the behavior side, and not only from the fact that the game is simpler or harder.
It's true, and I mean it's a tough balance, right? So yeah, you don't want to like completely nerf the AI for, you know, in low difficulty. Yeah, absolutely. It's a tough balance to. It's tough to balance difficulty during stealth, like overall. Yeah. Combat balancing is a lot easier, I think. So yeah, it's. I don't have a good answer. Sorry.
But like it's more like how much like did you leave to the level designer or the game designer to balance? Was it there like a bit like less control to them to avoid that they were nerfing too much AI?
We gave them a lot of control, okay. But I mean we work really closely with our the AI designer is with us, and our lead designer was always with us. Like it wasn't, you know, I don't know if you've been to any of the AI summit. It sounds like there's this big divide between design and programming sometimes, but for us it's not. We're really one big team, and so we work together. They're not going to do anything that's going to make our guys look stupid, basically.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Hey. Question on the perception again.
Sure.
With regards to those coffins,
yeah.
Did you link that to any kind of bone on the NPCs in terms of if they were looking, or was that completely based on facing angle of the root node, or? So
that's a great question. We did some kind of complicated stuff for that, right? So when they're in idle, we actually linked it to the facing. And the reason we did that was we wanted to give some ability to the animators to create some kind of cool idle animations without kind of like, you know, it sucks if you're kind of sneaking up on an NPC and the guy turns to sneeze, and because he did that, you get detected, right? Whereas when they were in search and in combat, where their sort of facing was a lot more, or sorry, their head look was a lot more deliberate, then it was linked directly to the head look. So, for example, to touch back on what Alex asked earlier, if they were going upstairs or if they were looking up, then the entire thing would tilt with them, basically. Thanks.
Nice.
So I think there was someone over there waiting.
Yeah, just a quick question regarding the using keys for audio.
Yes.
I'm just curious did that thing exist beforehand? I was curious if you could have done the same with maybe like a, what do you call this?
Pathfind?
A Pathfind function, basically.
Well, but the problem with Pathfind is you need nav mesh, right? So then if you want to know if one guy on a balcony hears another guy on a balcony, you don't actually want the Pathfind distance, you want some other distance, right? So for us, any two areas that were linked, whether it was sort of walkably or visually, those were all linked in that way that you saw. So there it was a door, but I sort of briefly mentioned that, you know, when Sam was on the rooftop, we knew that, and we knew it was unreachable because all of the nodes that were linked to him were non-walkable.
There was a tease node up there that kind of...
Exactly.
Yeah, just about the difficulty balancing. Did you actually change the distances and the shapes of those objects, or did you more like balance the time that it takes to actually detect?
Like everything.
Okay, excellent. Thanks.
I had a quick question following up about the tease. So let's say when Sam was up on the rooftop and he would make a pretty significant noise, would the AI not really be able to hear him because the T's were not connected?
Yeah, I don't want to.
No, that's it. It was connected, right? So, like I said, it was connected, but the choke node that connected it was non-walkable. But that mattered for the NPCs to know that they couldn't get up there.
Digital
but
setting,
it was still linked through T's essentially.
Maybe the deselect one.
Speaking of noise and detection and stuff like that, I noticed in one of your screenshots, Sam was crouching next to what looked like an air conditioner or something like that. Did you model the noise that he was making with ambient noise as well? So there's a relative thing, you know, if you're in the middle of a, factory or crouching next to, or had your rainstorm, for example, was there different thresholds of noise?
That's an excellent question. It's something that we considered doing, but we didn't actually do it. We had a couple of areas in the game where we did some special stuff for that, but no, it wasn't a generic thing that we did. Oh, did you want me to make that announcement for you? So I have a special announcement from Dave. I don't know if Aaron Canary is here, but Dave has your laptop charger. So. Should have come, Aaron. Should have come. Hey.
If you had any kind of, when one AI actually found the player, if there was any other system that actually sent that awareness or perception to the other AIs, or if they all immediately knew about it?
No, I mean, we had to propagate explicitly, right? So the idea was that if you, I didn't actually talk about that, but the idea is that even once you got detected, you were only detected by that single NPC, and he had to propagate that detection somehow to all of his buddies, so either by gunfire or by yelling, basically.
So that was there.
Just do that.
Would they talk to each other? Would they have any kind of bonus to find Sam now that someone has seen him and is engaged, or are they all basically stuck in the same awareness routine that they were already in?
I'm not sure I completely understand the question, but basically what would happen is, it would, so let's say all of the NPCs are in idle because nothing's happened yet, and then, one of them spots Sam and he starts firing, then because another NPC heard gunfire, that would then transition him into combat essentially, and then he would be in combat against a player, and then, like I mentioned earlier, if you were able to outflank them and disappear, they would sort of go back and start searching for you.
Kind of a follow-up on that one. How much did AI's behavior change if they knew that your character was there? Because I was wondering, because there's a lot of games that it's like
whatever. Just something placeholder text for now, basically.
Skyrim, where it's that was just the wind. You've got a dead body right next to you. Clearly, it was just the wind.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, we did a lot for that, actually. So first of all, we never, ever let them return to sort of pure idle. So, like, you wouldn't be in a gunfight 1 second and then, munching on a sandwich or whatever the next second. But the other thing, we actually had a difference between sort of pre-combat and post-combat search. So in that one slide where I talked about barks, there was this weird screenshot that probably nobody got, but that was a piece of our entire barks matrix. It was this huge kind of table that had all that stuff in there. And so our narrative guys did a fantastic job with that. And basically, yeah, it altered their behavior, so they would investigate differently, and altered their dialogue. So there was a difference between, like we think someone's here, he's made something's made a bunch of noise and we're looking around, versus there's a pile of bodies, or we've just been in a gunfight. So yeah, absolutely, we took that.
So there were several stages of, we don't think, nothing's here, to there might be something here, to we know there's something here, to there's something here that's trying to kill us. That would change.
Yeah, even to there was something trying to kill us and now we don't know where it is, basically. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
All right, that's it. Thanks a lot, guys.
All right. Hi, everybody. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Cell phones to quiet. Whoa, that's really loud. And don't forget the speaker evaluations at the end. That feedback's super helpful. And thanks so much for coming. My name's Simon Unger. I'm an animator. I've been animating games since about 2001. I was lead animator at EA, Square Enix, Robotoki, and I'm now working at Phoenix Labs. I also teach animation. I've taught at schools such as Noman, iAnimate, Vancouver Film School. Phoenix Labs, for those of you who hadn't heard of us, we are an indie developer based out of Vancouver, BC. We're a team of about 40 industry veterans working on our first original IP, Dauntless. So these are a few of the teams that the studio, that our company has worked in the past, the employees, sorry. As you can see, we have a diverse and experienced crew who aren't strangers to big AAA titles and big teams. Games like the Mass Effect franchise, League of Legends, Dead Rising, and Gears of War are just a few of the projects we've worked on. Most of the team have spent the majority of their careers on big teams and projects. Our motivation for going indie
so many of them.
And remaining smaller came from the desire to eliminate many of the dynamics involved in larger teams that tend to slow down agile decision making, and it lets our senior team focus on what's really important, which is making games. So Phoenix Labs was started with the idea that if you assemble a small, experienced group of people with great intentions, empower them to solve their own problems, they can make any project they throw themselves at great. So what is Dauntless? It's a co-op action RPG set in a science fantasy universe. 4 players band together to slay behemoths that threaten the survival of their fractured world. To give you guys a better idea of what that's all about, here's our announced trailer.
These guys can probably keep it.
So incidentally, that trailer was made in-house with just a handful of the team, while we were also working towards a pretty major pre-alpha milestone. So it's a good example of how we're able to produce a lot of content quickly and at a quality bar usually reserved for much bigger teams with larger budgets. We've got some lofty goals for Dauntless and for the studio, and no small amount of challenges to overcome. In my talk today, so I'm going to cover some of the ways we've found to make our work more efficient and more fun, and just our general mindset when we approach these challenges. So what are we up against? As I mentioned, we want to keep the studio relatively small, no more than 30 to 40 people. We wanted to challenge the convention of overcomplicated systems and processes, and instead work with less overhead, more empowerment, and less management. Our animation team consists of 3 animators. When we break down the scope of the game, that leaves 1 animator for player, 1 animator for behemoths, and another one to oversee the dialogue, NPCs, and narrative. We needed to avoid wasteful practices as well as optimize each person's contributions to the team. 1 or 2 people being blocked on a 100+ person team won't really derail a milestone, but could have pretty bad consequences on a team our size and at the pace we move. We all came from big AAA studios and projects and didn't want to sacrifice the quality we're used to delivering, nor the scope of the project we wanted to take on. We needed to find a way to deliver the experience we're after with the team and the budget we wanted to work with. Specific to animation, the challenge was how do we produce a high volume of animation at a quality we're happy with, and ensure the animations we do produce are getting the most mileage in game. We also wanted to create an appealing, stylized universe. The easy choice would have been to choose realism and just charge headfirst into the uncanny valley. Photo-based textures, unedited motion capture, default lighting, 3D scanned props and characters would have allowed us to create a lot of content quickly and with little direction to maintain continuity. For us, that didn't feel like an exciting proposition to work on and not really an appealing choice for the universe we wanted to create. But as many of you likely know, creating stylized, polished animation is pretty labor intensive, and polish time's not a luxury many teams get, especially smaller teams on their first try. And core to our game are behemoth battles. Boss encounters are hard enough to do to get right on their own, and on top of that, animating believable beasts is a challenging and time-consuming task for animation. There's a very good reason few games choose to make creatures a focal point. It's just really tricky to do well. So how do we approach all of this in a way that delivers something we're happy with without a giant team, massive budget, or unlimited time? For animation, turnaround time at an acceptable quality was one of our most important problems to solve. We didn't want to become a bottleneck for design, VFX, or audio, so creating and iterating animations quickly with as little effort as possible was paramount. Keyframing animations from scratch at the fidelity we're after is an expensive proposition, especially when you factor in the cost of the many revisions we typically take before finding the right mix of timing, coverage, and appeal for gameplay purposes. So what did we do? We decided we would make use of motion capture as much as we could. Luckily in Vancouver, we've got a few good options of mocap vendors nearby, but shooting externally can be expensive and not very conducive to iteration for a small studio. Early on, we determined that having access to our own motion capture space was going to be pretty vital. There were often times we would need only to prove out a small, very small aspect of gameplay and iterate on just a handful of moves. Booking a shoot at a local studio, casting an actor, craft services, and so on would have been way too expensive in both time and money, and ultimately work against the point of wanting to use mocap in the first place. One of the great aspects of being as agile as we are, making a decision like this and seeing the results becomes a really tight loop for us. From when we decided we should look into getting a mocap system and building our own and starting shooting was really only about 2 months. So now we had to figure out which system to get. Some of us on the team have had a lot of experience with various capture systems, mainly Vicon, which for a lot.
You're back. All right.
Long time has been the standard, but we wanted to give as many of the currently available options as we could find a chance. Some of the main factors that mattered to us when considering a system was ease of use. We couldn't have extra head count to run it. It had to be easy enough that 1 or 2 people on a team could shoot with as little setup time as possible. Scalability. Shooting more than 1 actor at a time, capturing rigid bodies or props, or maybe even doing facial capture. We wanted a system that could grow with our needs and upgrade easily in the future without having to retool the entire thing. Access to support. While we had a ton of experience working on mocap data and coordinating and directing mocap shoots, we didn't have very much experience solving and tracking data, setting up a mocap space, mocap volume, from scratch. Having instruction and using the system and a support line when things get a little confusing was pretty important to us. And of course, cost. We're working on a budget, and getting the most mileage for our money was a top concern. And lastly, data quality. Getting clean, easy to work with data was going to be crucial. If it was going to take a lot of time for us to clean that up, or imprecise capture data, we'd just lose a large part of the draw of using this productivity tool. So we looked at those criteria and weighed some of the currently available solutions against them. So these are the vendors we chose to evaluate. There are others out there, for sure. But we wanted to start with ones we'd either had experience with ourselves, or we could get feedback from people we know and trust, or at the very least had been used in a production environment. We talked to most of them, researched ones that didn't respond to our emails, and because we're a little crazy about our data, we made a decision matrix to weigh them all against each other as well as our criteria.
Wow.
So which did we choose? We ended up getting an OptiTrack system from Natural Point. We've got 16 of their Prime 13 cameras on tripods, and in our current space we're able to get about a 30 by 30 foot volume, and we've been really happy with how it's worked out. We chose it because it gives us the best cross-section of data quality, ease of use, portability, price. Our costs for all the cameras, tripods, suits, crash mats, everything ended up being only about the same as a couple of shoots at an external vendor. And so far on Dauntless, we've had about 70 shoots. So it's fair to say the system's paid for itself several times over. Excuse me. Setup was surprisingly easy. The time it took from the initial unboxing to our first capture was only about 2.5 hours. Mobility is also good for our trailer. We rented out a larger office space in our building. This is us doing it right there. And we were able to get about a 25 by 50 foot capture volume to get a little more running room in. It only took a couple of hours for us to break it down, move it downstairs, and set it back up again and be shooting. And we only needed it for a day, so the mobility was really, really great for that. It also satisfies our easy to use criteria. One person can set it up, put on a suit, and capture themselves, and then solve the retarget the data onto the gameplay rig. I've been able to do a small shoot on my own, about a dozen moves or so, and be back at my desk in under 30 minutes. This allows us to talk about some new gameplay ideas in the morning and be play testing them in the game before the end of the day. This type of iterations allowed us to try new ideas quickly and find the fun in the gameplay without being a slave to labor-intensive content creation and long iteration times, which, as many know, is often the enemy of quality in game development. You definitely don't need to jump into fully the same equipment we have. There are a lot of different setups out there to choose from, could fit a wide range of budgets. I should also say this isn't a paid endorsement of OptiTrack, although if anybody is here from OptiTrack, I wouldn't mind some more cameras. We've just been really happy with the equipment and support they've shown us. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, a lot of what hinders good content creation becoming great is iteration. So often the first idea isn't the best one, but if you've invested a ton of time into it, or your ability to iterate on it is cumbersome, you're going to be a little reluctant to make changes, and even if they're in the best interest of the product. Creating biped animations using mocap is a fairly trivial way to prototype, but creatures are a trickier matter. As most animators know, non-human characters are a time-consuming thing to animate by hand. In an effort to minimize possible throwaway work, we started prototyping creature gameplay using stepped or linear interpolation and only a few key poses to communicate the intent of the move. Within only a few hours, we can have a handful of attacks and locomotion moves in engine for the designers to create prototype encounters with and get a feel for pacing and staging. They're also free to scale, chop up, repurpose these placeholder anims until they get something that feels close enough to what they had in mind. After that, we can re-export these as FBX. FBX is to give us a rough framework to do a second pass on. This way the animators can be confident that all these moves have been vetted in engine many, many times and play tested repeatedly, so we're not going in blind. Working this way has greatly reduced the impact of revision work for us. And we continue to update these animations, adding in-betweens and ultimately moving to final polish, always play testing at each iteration and getting team feedback along the way. At no point do we ever put a polished animation in game that hasn't been play tested many, many, many times. Now this didn't come naturally for everyone on the team. It took quite some time for the non-animators on the team to be able to see past step-keyed animations and understand what the end goal was. I think this is really only possible after having worked through this a couple of times with the team. If you want to work this way, definitely expect some growing pains and complaints about animation quality or frame rate for a while, but it's definitely helped us speed up.
All of these were casting shadows.
So it was also important to get the most mileage out of these animations that we put into the game. We wanted to create a lot of diverse behemoth encounters, and spending all that time creating awesome animations would be a bit of a waste if they weren't being seen or used much. We made the decision to create some high-level categories in our game called a genus, we call it, to slot these different creature types into, mainly based on their physiology. Some examples of a genus would be here on the screen, like a mixed flyer or an agile quadruped or a theropod. Each variant in the genus shares the same skeleton type and rig. We can reuse and retarget animations within the same skeletal structure and change or replace geometry, color, size, effects, audio, and create unique encounters with often no new animation assets. We can even make small anatomy changes within a genus, such as adding or removing tails or wings, and even changing leg types, like from a reverse knee to a plantar leg. Some variations required a few new animations, some a little more. But this really only adds to the asset pool that genus can use and all the possible variations that we make in the future. Basically just adding more Lego pieces to our collection. Here's an example of a behemoth pangar with a variant Gnasher. By changing only a couple of animations, adjusting behavior and stats, as well as changing some play rates on base animations, we can create a unique and engaging encounter with much less work than creating a new behemoth from scratch.
I have fewer foliage pieces too.
It was also critical for us to solve complex animation problems with as few assets as possible. Much like our approach to animation, our environment team has a pipeline that allows them to create massive variety of playable terrain quickly. These can contain multiple biomes, sub-biomes, obstacles, complex nav meshes to locomote around. Encountering a behemoth could happen on a slope, in a valley, next to a cliff, or even in a forest. So a traditional animation system would require us to create a massive number of locomotion and combat animations to handle turns and slopes and leans and collision volumes. Again, we didn't want any solutions that involved just throwing people or assets at. We wanted something that was a bit more elegant, more tunable, and allows us to use as few animations as possible.
All right, here we go.
So as an example, here is a behemoth traversing a curved path on a fairly complex slope. It's a lot to ask for a single animation to solve, and a pretty common problem for games. To make this trickier, he's quite large, and he's a longer creature with a tail. Navigating around multiple obstacles while traversing this slope. We could choose to solve this with blend spaces and a bunch of animations for coverage, but we really felt like there was a better way to approach this. We ended up using a full body IK solution, and we chose to integrate an off-the-shelf package called Ikinema. And using these IK layers, we were able to do a lot with only just a single walk cycle.
It's hilarious.
So here's an example of that same walk cycle, same path, nothing's changed with Ikinema turned on. Conforming to the path, foot planting, and a look at to lead the head into the turns are all working together to help turn just this same walk cycle into something that's a lot more versatile. We also use this for hit reactions, aiming attacks and appendages, especially when they're on uneven terrain or a slope, such as when he does a tail attack on a slope. It takes care of that and keeps the alignment.
There's too much grass, maybe too much.
So even with these measures and many others, we still have a really tight timeline and a lot of content to create, especially when we go live. So we did have to outsource some animation work. We were looking to do development better than we had in the past, and how we approached outsourcing was no different. Having a lot of experience with traditional outsourcing business model, we knew we didn't want to work that way for animation. Outsourcing typically has a point of diminishing return. The usual high in-studio overhead with pre-planning, managing, directing, and maintaining dictates that there's got to be a big enough bulk of work to send out. We knew we weren't going to have hundreds of animations to send out at a time, and we couldn't sacrifice a lot of in-house cycles to overseeing animation outsourced work. So we wanted to find a partner rather than a vendor. A group who worked more as an extension of our team and collaborated with us rather than just completing heavily directed work. We were super fortunate that we didn't have to search long for such a partner. We teamed up with Steamroller Studios, whose creative director happens to be a friend, Jalil Sadul. They're a group of amazing people based out of Florida, and they brought a ton of film and creature experience to the table that ended up being a really great match for our gameplay experience.
They make it so like everyone else is afraid to say
Instead of
anything.
a faceless group of contractors in a far-off land, we got new teammates who were invested in the quality of our product and could collaborate on ideas with us. Help in simple blocking of test animations, polishing animation we'd already blocked out in-house, or just ideating on what a behemoth attack could be. Were just a few of the ways that this partnership was a massive help to us. Being able to hand off animations with minimal direction and knowing that they were reviewing and checking the quality of their work before we ever even saw it. It was just like having a team of experienced animators in the studio with us. Having outsourced several times, this was definitely a breath of fresh air for me, and something I'd always wanted an outsourcing partnership to look like. So those are some of the high-level solutions, but I also wanted to share some of the practical workflows and techniques we've been using along the way as well.
You know, it's just not how it works.
So one of the bigger time savers for me was the ability to use mocap for more than just human characters. I've been wanting to try this for some time, and I felt strongly that it had a lot of potential to be a potent productivity tool for us, but sadly my first attempts at capturing my movements and retargeting them to a creature didn't go as well as I had hoped. I started by characterizing the creature's proxy model, essentially defining the skeleton for it in Motion Builder and working with the solving parameters to get the data to fit the anatomy and default posture of the creature. Maybe with a little more careful setup and fiddling with parameters, I could get a little closer to something that was usable, but from this vantage point, it was a little more comical than practical. So the problem was, I was trying to do this how we always solve mocap, by remapping on a joint level to the final character. While there's definitely more elegant ways to retarget data to wildly different anatomies, using more complex IK solving, for example, the end goal was I just wanted a faster way to define weight, posing, and timing on my character, not necessarily a precise performance transfer. It also needed to be done without having to write a new pipeline or involve a team of people to help me out with that. So instead of forcing the anatomy to match, I chose to think of captured performance as a series of movements on centers of masses. So in this way, I can sculpt the data to work with these relative masses. Instead of trying to force joints to match on disparate anatomies, I just translated the performance into these collections of areas of movement. I could sculpt these to work with different starting positions and orientations, and if a part of the capture didn't work with me, I could just chuck it out and key it myself pretty quickly. My first attempt at this gave significantly better results than the first.
I'm just not afraid of it, you know, so I guess people are
So this is literally my first animation I tried this on. I found the scene. It's a simple test, I know, but this actually only took me about 30 minutes to get here, and that included solving the mocap data. It'd probably take an animator a considerably longer time to get to this same place, and I'm starting with higher fidelity base to work from when finishing this versus blocking. So with just a little bit more work, keying the hands and feet, polishing the performance, and adding a little bit of texture, I can get decent results with much less time than it would take to keyframe to this level of detail. So how did I do this? I'm sorry to say it is not a very technically impressive workflow. I start by bringing in the exported motion capture into Motion Builder and solving it to our player skeleton. I've usually fixed any jitters, pops, or weird rotations in Motive, and that's Optitrack's capturing and editing software by this point. But if there are any other issues, I'll address them here on the control rig before going any further. I'll also often do a quick retiming pass using the time warp tool, as I like it a little bit better than the one in Maya, even though this one can be a bit more finicky.
Decent.
I've a general idea of what my timing and spacing is going to be, and will get it as close as I can, but still thinking really broad strokes first at this point. It's not on the final creature model, so it's really tricky to be super accurate here. And then I export this as an FBX, bring that into Maya, and I import a set of locators I created ahead of time that live in a simple hierarchy. I've found that this was important, that these live in a parent-child relationship similar to how the skeleton is set up, and that avoids a lot of problems in the transfer on a lot more complicated physical moves, especially when the behemoth is inverted. Each of these markers is used to define a center of mass that I want to transfer from the capture. My main ones I want are hips, torso, head, hands, feet. I'll usually grab movement from the elbows, knees, shoulders, but only use them if I really need it. I'll parent the appropriate joint to the exported skeleton in a position that best represents the point of movement I want to represent, and bake that translation and rotation onto the locators. At this point, I can blow away the skeleton, and I'm left with just the locators, which I'll save out, merge with my behemoth rig, and start and set my starting pose, in this case, my idle.
Junglish, Eastern Asian kind of area, and there's like
then just align those locators to the anim layer, on an anim layer, sorry, to the control points I want on the behemoth rig. I just parent the rig to the locators, bake that translation and rotation, and then blow away the locators from my scene. Now I'm free to insert my M pose, retime the animation, and just start layering on top of this base movement to get the performance I'm after. So what are the limits of this system?
Isn't showing up. Neither is
obviously,
the door.
Putting movement on a bipedal creature is a little more forgiving than a quadruped. I can still use the timing and weight of the main center of masses, the hips and the torso. I also sometimes use props in mocap to approximate the difference in limb length if needed, usually just giant styrofoam blocks. Even just having basic info on a character's fuselage helps speed up the first pass, and keying quickly using IK on the arms and legs and just makes getting a detailed block out really, really quick. It does get a little awkward when somebody walks in on me doing this in the mocap room though. So a big focus of our culture at Phoenix Labs is making sure we're spending our time solving the right problems. For animation, we try to remove as many pain points in our workflow as possible. A pain point is something that causes an animator to either lose momentum while working on something or an unnecessarily repetitive task. Basically anything that takes you out of your flow, as much as I hate that word. Whether it be the creation or the exporting end, a lot of our processes and tools are built around minimizing these repetitive or time-heavy tasks.
Still kind of expensive here, 27.
For example, I found I was spending way more time than I would have liked animating the tail on behemoths, especially during the initial couple of passes to prove gameplay.
44.
This was even more of a problem on complex moves that required the tail to be interacting with the ground plane. I wondered if there was a way to automate the majority of this using dynamic simulations in Maya. Not being familiar with dynamic sims at all in Maya, this took a little bit of trial and error to figure out the process that produced the results I was after. But here's how I set that up on our rig. So I first needed to start with my base pose for the tails. For this, again, I'm using the idle pose. To avoid any circular dependencies, I need to decouple the simulation from the main character rig, and because of that, I tend to leave animating the tail like this to the very end. First, I need the animation for the tail's parent, so in this case, it's the hips, to live on something outside the rig. I like to use locators for just about everything, so I'll go with that. All I'm doing is basically just baking the translation and rotation out to a locator from the hip control. I do this kind of thing a lot, so I've got a little Python script I wrote to make this a single button press or a hotkey. Then I duplicate the joint chain of the tail and unparent that from the main skeleton, and create a curve that follows the tail with a CV at each joint, and make that curve a hair simulation. Parent the resulting follicle to the locator that we baked with the hip movement on it, and then setting that curve as a spline IK for the duplicate joint chain. I can then use this joint chain to drive my FK controllers on the...
Okay, well, here, I'll... We have good research showing creating a server in UE4 and getting the game. No offense, but it's been like years since I had to do that, literally, multiple years. So, and it was one of the first tutorials I did. Oh, interesting. That was a while ago. Let me see. 4. No, 3. Blue. No, yellow. Okay. Look how much better the frames are now. Yeah, this is good. I can work with that. Occasional dips as my son is flying around and I'm streaming and all that. It's decent. Oh, I didn't play the sound effect. Damn. Oh, anyway, I'm really happy about the sound effect. I just stole it from the Unreal Engine VR editor. Sound effect tools.
Welcome to the halls of creation.
Let's do, well, let me do the last one on this island. Just the elf is the swamp, sun elf, sky elf, sun elf. There we go. Oops, I have a cart. Let's see how this drives on the smooth sand. I can go backwards decently. Sort of. Anyway, the FPS here is fine, as you can see, even with items shadowed. Oops. I just thought Trader would be a cool aesthetic.
And if the tail is going to be interacting with the ground plane, I'll just create a simple polyplane and use that as a collision object, or you can actually set ground plane as collision within the follicle settings as well. At that point, I can tweak the dynamic properties of the follicle, things like stiffness, dampening, motion drag, to make the tail feel like it has the correct weight and mass. And I also key things like how much attraction to the original curve and how much gravity and friction lives on the ground plane to help sculpt that tail's movement. It took me a while to figure out which settings in the dynamic properties I needed to adjust to get me close to what I was after. There are a lot of them in there. But now I can get away with only a handful of them, and it'll get me most of the way there. When I'm happy with how that's working, I just bake it back down to the rig. And now I can key over that using layers or exaggerate the base animation just as if it was motion capture. So here's the kind of results I can get now with about 5 minutes of setup work. It's not perfect, but you can see even subtle interactions with the ground. That could take a while to animate by hand if I didn't use this method. With even a little more time adjusting and keying the settings on the rig, I can get a lot better results. When we combine this with our Echinima in Engine, we can be more adventurous with creature design and adding and removing appendages on our behemoths. Rather than trying to make safe choices when we design these creatures, we can take a little bit more risk. So this works great when I need to have the tail just arbitrarily follow the creature, but what if I want to define parts of that movement, such as in an attack or a personality move? For that, I'm essentially doing the same thing, only with a couple of extra steps. First, I'll roughen the main poses I need the tail to hit on the behemoth rig. Then I'll duplicate the tail joint chain just like last time, remove any constraints or dependencies, and then duplicate it again. So I have 2 versions of that joint chain. The first one I'll constrain to the original tail and bake the animation back to that. And then remove those constraints. So I'm left with block tail animation on one of the joint chains. I'll create the curve same as last time, but instead I'll skin that curve to the animated joint chain. From here, it's pretty much the same, turning the curve into a follicle, using the dynamic curve to drive the second chain, and then using that second chain to drive the FK rig. In this method, curve attraction and dampening become the main dynamic property to key, and just make sure I hit the poses I'm after. This method takes a little longer than the first, but still far less time than hand keying to achieve the same results. We've since started incorporating this into our rigs and tools, so that's not a manual setup for me each time, which makes it even faster. I've also used this for smaller things like the scales on his back. I don't really have the time to animate each of those by hand. You can see there's a lot of them. But being able to just sim that quickly and bake that back to the rig can save a ton of time. So I know this isn't a revolutionary way of working. I think Naughty Dog showed a similar thing in their tool set quite some time ago. But it can be used for almost anything. You just want to get some really quick overlapping movement on, even if you just end up using the sim chains for reference and rotoing over it. We've also used animation dynamics in Engine for obvious things like cloth, of course, but we also use things like muscle jiggle on behemoths, player armor, or anything else that just might be easier to sim in Engine over top of animation state changes. So I can't talk about animation pipelines without talking a bit about rigging and tools. Because we have limited animation tech art support and a myriad of different behemoths and player rigging needs, not to mention everything else a TA does, we needed to find a way to approach rigging in a way that was efficient and reusable. So we have a Python-focused tool set for creating and animating behemoth rigs. Because our behemoths have a variety of proportions and variation that also needed to be expanded upon in an agile way, the rigging toolkit uses a module definition system to break up the workload of rigging the different parts of a behemoth. This allows for a rule set to be applied to many behemoths based on the parts that they have. If a new part or functionality needs to be added later, a new module can be written and added to the system. The animation toolset hooks into these modules to search out what information it needs to affect those parts. An example of this would be the IKFK switching tool knows about what modules it's looking for, and therefore what attributes of that module it's looking for, instead of being name-based or hard-coded into the rig. So these are examples of modules for different parts of the rig. Some attributes are used during the creation process, and some are used by the animation tools. Limbs get defined in an interactive way during a placement phase, and then committed during a creation phase. This was generally successful for us. It could be greatly expanded upon in the future for to better create a definition of the rig as a whole. Also, when a skeleton is already predefined, the modules needed to pass it, hooking up the joints it cares about, and that could be better automated as well. We'd also like the tool set just to have a better front end or wizard, so it's better for people other than just tech artists to use. And also because the physiology between the behemoths is dramatically different, this led us to some different needs that you might not think about.
Let's wait for the sun to rise and see
The center of mass was a big one for us. Generally, we may allow for different pivot points for the whole body in the rig to make it easier to animate, but when procedurally moving characters in the engine through iKinema, we needed to define a hard center of mass over the root and the skeleton. For quads and bipeds, this is sometimes obvious, but for our biped quadruped hybrid on the right, it led us to think about where that behemoth would be pivoting from during its movement most of the time and create a chest-based center of mass. This was contradictory to the bind pose, and the rigging toolkit needed to be able to take this into account. And finally, just quality of life improvements. As mentioned earlier, removing as many of the repetitive and time-consuming tasks as we can helps to speed up iteration times and make the work more enjoyable. And that leads to higher quality overall. Some examples of this are automating mocap pipelines, tools to help with multiple frame range exports from a single file, IKFK switching, pivot point changes for any control mid-animation, and mirroring, and just easy to use pose libraries as well. So lastly is something that seems to come up a lot in discussions about using mocap. Often the thinking is we're not making a realistic game, so we can't use mocap. While it definitely takes a little bit of work to get the results you're after, when you're confident with the process, you can get to the end result in much less time than all hand-keyed movement. Another great thing about using capture is that it gives you a fairly consistent baseline of quality across all your characters and your project. So a common method used when exaggerating mocap is to lift key poses from the performance. This is done by putting the motion capture on a base layer and creating an override layer with the weight turned down, and then you set keys where you want to keep the movement, essentially giving you your block out and your in-betweens for free, and just allowing you to retime in the graph editor, or even in the timeline. This works the same way in both Maya and Motion Builder. While this is a great workflow and something I still use from time to time, what bothered me was losing all of those micro rotations and detail that you get from mocap, and we spend so much time on the polish pass trying to add that back in. I wanted a workflow that allowed me to sculpt that performance without being too destructive to the original data. So what this mainly took was a bit of a mental shift from thinking of motion capture as a recording of a performance and rather to a collection of curves to sculpt and manipulate, much like the centers of mass that I showed for creature movement. So I'll explain this with a really simple example. So once I get my capture onto my rig, my first priorities are timing and spacing. It helps to have a clear idea of the goal in mind, especially before putting the suit, but sometimes this is a little bit of trial and error. When I'm working this way with mocap, I'm still always thinking, as I said, broad strokes first. I don't want to get really, really caught up in small details right now. For retiming, I'll use either Time Warp in Motion Builder or the Retime tool in Maya. What I'm doing at this stage is just trying to recreate the tempo and feeling I have in my head for the move. The actual movement isn't being exaggerated here, only the timing and spacing. So it takes just a little bit of imagination. It's probably not the only time I'll touch the timing. I'm just trying to get it as close as I feel is right at this point. When I'm more or less happy with that, I'll plot it back to the main rig so I don't have keys on my subframes. If the move calls for it, I'll insert my start and end pose here and work the movement to come in and out of those poses properly. For the most part, I use the lattice tool in the graph editor. So remember, I'm trying to preserve a lot of the micro movements in the capture, so just deleting large chunks of data to blend into poses kind of works against this. So I use the lattice tool a lot, just trying to sculpt these curves and sculpt the performance. When I get my poses insert, it's time to start adding in the exaggerated movement. So I go with my timing, sorry. For this, I use layers. Again, starting with broad strokes, I'm trying to hit the main poses and movement changes to define the staging here. In this instance, I'm trying to exaggerate the distance and timing of this jump. I might pop back to retiming while doing this to get the first pass nailed down. When I'm happy with the main timing and posing and spacing pass, then I'll start to refine silhouettes, intermediate details. The final passes for smaller things like overlaps, contacts, cleanup, and other details like that. Much of this I still keep on layers to avoid touching the base capture. And then I can just use an override layer to key the weight on and off if I need to really override a part of it.
Welcome.
So here we can see the difference between what I started with and the end result. once you get comfortable working this way, it can cut down the amount of time it takes to achieve the same result, doing it by hand considerably. This example here, it's still pretty rough and needs a bit more work, but including capturing the data, solving it, and reworking it in Maya, I've only spent a couple of hours just to get to this point. So even for a really fast animator, that could be pretty challenging to do with keyframing only. So don't be intimidated to try out motion capture, even if your project might not seem like it calls for it. Much of the hype around it has been centered on preserving the actor's authentic performance. But I encourage you to think of it more of a productivity tool.
Oh, no.
So now, not every move in our game was created this way. There's definitely a lot of hand-keyed animation as well, and it ultimately comes down to each of the animators' individual expertise to choose what method is best for the thing that they're creating that day.
Yeah, that's it for now.
But for complex movement, we found this to be really, really valuable. So as you can see, there wasn't one single magic solution to all our development challenges. It took these and many, many more tiny changes in how we approach development, always asking ourselves the same question. Are we working on the most important problems right now, and what's the best way to solve them? Curating that culture in the studio has been the main ingredient in our success so far.
Arrivederci and all that good stuff.
So if you